what we see in the National Student Survey in terms of assessment and feedback is also reflected not just in the NUS surveys but also in PTES, the Postgraduate Taught Experience Survey. So prioritisation of assessment and feedback practices is also reflected more locally here at City in current concerns. There's our annual MOT to ensure that every assessment has its associated assessment criteria. Probably more prominent and on people's minds at the moment is the increasing reduction of feedback turnaround times. And I would interpret those priorities as providing clarity to students, respectively, clarity by which assessment is conducted and the clarity over the time frame by which the results of that assessment is delivered back to students. Now, as I'm sure we all know, assessment and feedback practices are quite terminology heavy. Between the regulatory framework, between institutional policy, module specifications, programme specifications, learning outcomes, assessment criteria, there's a lot of jargon floating around. So the challenge becomes one of satisfying regulatory frameworks while not losing the meaning, the intelligibility to our purported target audience, and one has to assume that we are writing these things for students and not simply to satisfy regulatory frameworks. And that is the purpose of my study, as Ian hinted in his introduction, thinking about language, thinking about vocabulary. I've opened lines of dialogues with students in order that we can satisfy ourselves that as staff and students we are on the same page. And hence I rather frivolously drew on the parallel with George Bernard Shaw and what he famously said about Britain and America being divided by a common language. The words are the same, the language is the same. The meaning may be subtly different enough to divide us two demographics, whether it's Britain and America, or indeed staff and students. So the study that concerns the clarity of vocabulary in assessment and feedback practices, and clarity is needed in various different areas in terms of learning outcomes and assessment criteria. It's about the difference between, for instance, description and critical engagement. Do students understand that? In terms of the feedback itself, and this has come up several times today already, it is the value, if any, of phrases that we all see now and then, like, this needs to be clearer, or you need to express yourself more clearly. Well, okay, Mr. Examiner, but you need to be clearer as well, that's what we want. And finally, within the wider context of assessment policy, and what has, perhaps this is a sign of the time, what has come up more than anything else in this study is the clarity that is needed over prompt and timely, over the words prompt and timely. I think Graham Grips mentioned that this morning, didn't he? Prompt, what does that actually mean? Is 3 weeks really prompt? So I've undertaken various information gathering exercises throughout the year. Most recently I've interviewed a range of programme reps and people who work with programme reps, which has been very insightful because these are people who are evidently not just representing their own views but representing the views of an entire cohort and feeding in the experiences of that cohort. Which is lovely for a researcher to speak to one person and feel like you've spoken to 40. What I've done with the interviews and various information gathering exercises, student consultations and focus groups and workshops and so on, I have subjected my data to a thematic analysis, and I'll be presenting the findings of that analysis in the course of this presentation. So it's straightforward: introduction, findings and analysis, and then a series of recommendations by way of conclusion which have come out of the findings and analysis. So the students have made recommendations that I feel are worth putting in front of us all now. I will try and mention to Ian, I will try and keep to about 30 minutes because I very much hope there will be some discussion coming out of this. One thing I would mention is this is an ongoing consultation, so if there's anybody you feel I should be speaking to, both staff and students, I would be absolutely delighted to hear from you and to hear from them. Let me move to findings and analysis. I said I'd speak for about half an hour. Of course, that assumes my voice will last for half an hour, but fingers crossed. Lawrence, the dirty calling may stop early.
Yeah.
Did you get that on film? Findings and analysis, the themes fell quite neatly into 4 different areas. The first being about the meaning of feedback, the second about issues of timeliness, the third about clarity of feedback, and the last concerning assessment criteria. So in terms of what feedback means, The students were unanimous that feedback had or comprised a qualitative component. We've got a choice selection of quotations on the slide. The first mentions a commentary, the second mentions an explanation. What is particularly interesting to me about this is that it feels a little out of kilter with my experience, my academic practice with students, and this has been discussed earlier today as well, about students being primarily, if not exclusively, interested in the mark, and hence the third and fourth quotations on the slide. We all know, I'm sure from experience, that if a student is querying feedback, what they're doing ultimately is querying the mark. They feel they should have got higher. If they're querying something qualitatively, it's because they're making a disagreement, they're building a case for the mark being higher. That, to me, seems to be their concern. And one of the students even confirmed what I suspected, that students just look at the mark. I mean, certainly, dare I say this, when I was a student, that's where I would look. Sometimes, I'm going to be honest, sometimes I did not read the qualitative feedback, particularly if it was too late to be of any help to me. Slightly less anecdotally, I did a little study, I did a study with students last January where I made a module assessment available through two means. I put the full feedback in the office for them to collect, and I put the mark only on Moodle. And I told them where they would find both. Then a few days later, I asked them pseudonymously to fill in a survey saying where they went for their feedback. And the results, well over 30 respondents. This is just the first page of the doodle poll, and you can see the second column, I collected my mark via Moodle, is the column where almost everybody, only 3 respondents did not. Cheryl Cole and Prince William are dummies. I've always wanted to say that in public. And Darth Vader as well. That was me filling in the doodle poll to show students how to do it. So almost exclusively, everyone has gone to Moodle, which means the students maybe didn't realise this, but what I was really asking them was, do you want the full report? Do you want the qualitative feedback? Or do you just want the mark? And overwhelmingly, it seems for an end of module assessment, these particular batch of students, they just wanted the mark. Now, 2 respondents to my study mentioned to me that feedback is used in a variety of different senses. Well, in 2 very, very crucial but very different senses. One is feedback from students, the other is feedback to students. And of course, what we're talking about here is feedback to students. But that is a cause for confusion that perhaps we could iron out. And I guess student handbooks might be the best way of doing that. In fact, one respondent to my survey answered all the questions on feedback as if I meant feedback from students rather than feedback to students. Now I've got probably the most to say about the next theme, which is timing of feedback. I'm not interested in exploring the question of whether we have managed to meet our feedback turnaround times this year are 3 and 4 weeks. I'll park that one straight away. What I will note is that programme representatives did seem to have a very clear idea of exactly when their assessments were going to come back. Whether or not that was in accordance with assessment policy, you'll note one of the quotes on the slide, the third one, discusses 5-week feedback. Now, of course, there is no 5-week feedback. That seemed to be the practice in this respondent's programme, department, school, but this respondent knew that that was the practice and that it was adhered to. Likewise, we also see on the slide that students seem to understand there is something of a balancing act to be undertaken between timeliness of feedback and quality of feedback. One respondent noted that although the policy on summative assignments was well defined, the policy for formative assessments was generally much less well defined, which is important, particularly important given this morning's keynote, of course, where formative assessment was argued quite strongly for. One participant did make a rather telling observation that timeliness and quality both matter for interim assessments, but for end-of-module assessments, this person felt only quality mattered because timeliness isn't as important. Now, I mean, there is an issue there with well, this person was obviously not taking that feedback into another module, but feedback doesn't feed onwards in quite the same way into different modules as it feeds into the module for which the assignment is associated. So I found that quite a telling, particularly when we're dealing with exams, when you do not get the script back to begin with. So that participant was thinking about context, whether an assessment is an interim assessment or an end-of-module assessment. And the last quotation on the slide explicitly says, timely needs to be seen in context. That is an issue that I wanted to spend a couple of minutes thinking about, because this idea of a one-size-fits-all deadline, I mean, the 3 weeks, 4 weeks, that is our deadline. But as I'm always saying to people, it's not compulsory to take the whole 3 weeks or 4 weeks. And there may be other factors to consider. If the next deadline is 2 weeks down the road, well, you need to turn around in 1.5 weeks, don't you? In fact, we had that come up in one of our modules earlier on in the year, and what we found is that one has to manage students' expectations very carefully there. Because if students get into the mindset that, although the deadline is 3 weeks, everything's going to come back in a week and a half, then suddenly if something comes back in 3 weeks, they say, oh, you took your time over that one, didn't you? So that's one aspect of context. Another aspect of context, it was alluded to by James this morning, who of course is a student on my programme. There are 2 points where I felt in terms of timeliness of feedback, we haven't quite been on the same page as students. And it does concern vocabulary, the vocabulary being the word weeks. When we have bank holidays, and of course we had 2 last week, that is not part of our working week. So 3 weeks to someone who works does not mean the same thing as 3 weeks to students who just look at the calendar. 3 weeks with a bank holiday in between, to me that's 3 weeks and 1 day. To students, they might still see it as 2 weeks. So that's one aspect in which I don't feel we're quite on the same page as students. And the other is when feedback dates fall in the holidays. If we turn something around within 3 weeks, but the students don't pick it up for 6, has it been turned around in 3 weeks or 6? In the student's eyes, has it been turned around in 3 weeks or 6? That one I don't have a solution to, but perhaps that's something we can pick up in the Q&A. There's another issue related to context, the final issue, and then I'll move to the third theme. And that concerns the notion of the 4-week turnaround, meaning you've got to take all 4 weeks. That actually, I mean, I have heard on more than one occasion a moderator say, well, when's the deadline? It's not due yet, I'll leave it. Oh, it's not due for a couple of weeks, well, I don't have to do it yet. And as I already said, it's not compulsory to take the full 4 weeks. That can put markers in a very difficult position if the students say to the marker, well, have you marked our work? Yes. Well, can I have it then? No, sorry, the moderator hasn't moderated it. So there's another issue there of context. 3 and 4 weeks are the deadline, the maximum that we're supposed to take. It is quite telling what the NUS statement is on feedback. It talks a lot about context, about what the purpose of feedback is, about it has to be the sort of length of time that is useful to the students and useful to their learning. But different NUS documents will give different suggestions. I've seen 1 week being suggested for generic group feedback. I've seen 3 weeks being suggested. I've seen 4 weeks being suggested. So the NUS seems to be rather shifting its ground on that. But it does emphasise that we need to consider context and usefulness. Let's move on from timeliness. So the third theme concerns clarity of feedback. And I'm sure we're all aware of the top 10 least helpful phrases. I've written a few down. This isn't clear, this needed to be better, this could have gone further. One that came up in the course of the interviews was, you could have included more on X. Which, well, maybe, but if the assignment is 6,000 words and the student's handed in 6,000, he or she is not going to understand that unless you also say, this is what you could have cut out in order to make room for what I wanted to see, which was presumably more relevant. So in terms of clarity of phrases, that did come out in the interviews I conducted. And another respondent did share with me an instance in which the feedback was unclear because there wasn't much of it, just words like yes or no or good. And what happened in that case, so the respondent said we had marks, but we had no commentary whatsoever on our feedback. I think it was 1 or 2 pencil words like yes and good written on the paper, but that was it. And people really felt that they'd been disadvantaged by that. That's possibly the sting in the tail. People felt they'd been disadvantaged. What the tutor in that instance, and I don't know who the tutor was or even what the programme was in this case, what the tutor said apparently was that the feedback was implicit in the marking system. If there are 10 marks for presentation and you've got 2 out of 10, well, clearly you need to work harder on your presentation. But that is only telling you what was wrong, not how to get better. And feedback, I would argue, anyway, needs to do more than just tell you what was wrong. On a positive note, the study participant who shared that with me did say that it highlights how important feedback was. And on another positive note, the mechanisms that are there for interpreting feedback, mechanisms like office hours, like emailing tutors, like asking for a meeting, like addressing issues of feedback in staff-student liaison committee meetings, they seem to be well known by students. One point that was made by a respondent was that, quote, certain lecturers are better than others at inviting you to come and meet with them and discuss feedback with them, adding that sometimes these things had to be rather chased down. So an element of inconsistency that has come up time and again in interviews, and we know that from the last National Student Survey, if nothing else. But the demand for additional opportunities to talk about feedback face-to-face leads me to wonder if we're missing a bit of a trick in overlooking opportunities for dialogic feedback. Now, I was quite surprised when I ran a focus group in March with 12 students, and we explained the different kinds of feedback: written feedback, podcasts, screencasts, face-to-face dialogic, and so forth. And then I asked them anonymously, using the personal response system, which one they felt would be best, how they would like to receive feedback. And half, to my surprise, my pleasant surprise, half of them said dialogic feedback. I suppose in a sense that stands to reason that a two-way feedback is always going to be better than a one-way feedback. But I was very surprised, but I was expecting them to have instantly gone for familiarity, for written feedback. And this is echoed at national level. There are various initiatives, and I'm sure you know, towards giving students not just feedback, but feedback in the form in which they want to receive it. So moving on now to the last of our 4 themes. So assessment criteria and learning outcomes. And there is much evidence, I'm sure you'll be very happy to hear this, that assessment criteria are being provided across the piece in terms of what I've had oversight of. There is some residual confusion as to the difference between assessment criteria and grade-related criteria, both of which are defined, but it's a different definition in the university's assessment and feedback policy. And then there's a third type of criteria as well, the sort of 10 marks for presentation, 20 marks for sources, 40 marks for originality, and 30 marks for, I don't know, watering the plants or something, which to me is not quite what assessment criteria means in terms of university assessment and feedback policy, but seem to be how assessment criteria were understood by several of my respondents. Again, there's an issue of inconsistency in that students did remark that some assessment criteria are more detailed than others, and likewise the question of clarity did come up now and then, whether assessment criteria lead them to know exactly what is required of a given assessment. When entering this study, I did have a little concern about the thesaurus approach that I'm sure we're all familiar with, that the notion that you write your assessment criteria and learning outcomes by picking your favourite verbs. And this is one of several tables given in the ubiquitous Fried, Kettridge and Marshall. But there is some quite refreshing evidence to suggest that students do indeed understand the difference between analysis and critical analysis. And they also seem to be confident in their understanding of the difference between different levels, level 4, level 5, level 6, and so on. And proof comes in the form of one student who, actually without any prompting, gave me this. It seems as though first year is discuss, second year critically analyse, and third year critically analyse and evaluate. That was a result that I really wasn't anticipating. In fairness, I should say this student went on to say that there was a certain sense in which credit wasn't given when these things had been exceeded, when a first year critically analyses rather than just discusses. But nonetheless, that the point is still made. There is, however, some evidence that students' understanding of what is required of them at different assessments and different levels does not result from the formal documentation. They are not getting this information from assessment criteria and learning outcomes and so on. They are getting it from current practices and their experience of current practices. For example, doing the work, talking to peers at different stages of the programme. So that leads me to the recommendations and conclusions that have arisen in large part from what I've learnt conducting these student interviews and focus groups and workshops and so on. So following on from the idea that the formal documentation only gives some of the story and that students interpret the formal documentation through their own experience and those of the peers, it may be beneficial to make available to them genuine scripts, genuine papers that students in previous cohorts have written, which I think is another thing that Graham Gibbs advocated in this morning's keynote. Genuine sample papers as distinct from model answers. As one respondent put it, I think model answers don't really give us a clear picture, but if we actually would see a student paper, we would be able to relate more to that. So not a model, but something that's actually being done, something they can really relate to. And off the back of that, I did an experiment last term. I secured permission for 2 papers from a previous student cohort, which have been fully marked by me, all the feedback, all the pro forma feedback report, the mark, the annotations, everything. I secured permission for that to be made available to the students via Moodle very deliberately, so I could track how many people engage with it. Over 40% of the class. I was rather hoping it would be 100%, but over 40% nonetheless suggests there is some demand for authentic sample papers to be disseminated where possible. One respondent to my study also suggested extending inductions to modules and programmes, to talking about the content of modules, the preparation for assessments and the assessments themselves. This is something that resonates at national level. And another suggestion that has also been articulated at national level is the idea of involving students in writing learning outcomes and assessment criteria. Now, of course, for my study, which is about, is there a gulf between the way that staff use terminology and the way that students understand it, immersing them in that vocabulary would help to close that gap, if there is one. It would also start to give them more ownership of their programme, of their module. Fourth recommendation is that mechanisms could be developed such that for every assessment, students always know where they can go to seek further guidance and advice on their feedback. Now, there's a workshop I ran with a couple of colleagues back in November, one of the outputs of which was a standardised pro forma for use across the programme. And one of the elements of that standardised pro forma was a line across the bottom saying, if you wish to discuss this feedback on this assessment, you will find the tutor here at the following day and time. And so every feedback pro forma is required to go back with a day and a time at which somebody can be there to discuss it. And that was one of the outputs of an assessment feedback workshop that you can read all about, should you have the inclination to do so, up on the Educational Vignettes blog. And last recommendation, thinking about the question of dialogic feedback and dialogic tutorials to discuss feedback face-to-face. The thought occurs that tutorials are not just an excellent place for delivering feedback and talking about how to improve a student's work, but also for getting them familiar with the assessment criteria and managing their expectations. It's about expectation management in relation to the process of assessment. Students come to me a lot of the time, I'm sure they come to you as well, with formative draft work, and they not only want to know what it's like and how it can be improved, but what kind of mark it would get. And my practice has been to say, rather than to say, oh, I think that's a 65 or I think that's a 57, to reach for the assessment criteria. and to say, let's have a look at it in tandem with the assessment criteria, let's do this process together, let's see where we can put it on the grand scale of 0 to 100 together. So that sort of immerses them in the process as well. So I'm going to finish up there, but just by way of a codetta, I might mention that several of the programme representatives I spoke to emphasised how important feedback and assessment processes were, and how much they welcomed the university's endeavours to enhance those processes and practices. So it's comforting, or to me at least, it's comforting that many of our efforts are being recognised and appreciated by the students themselves. Thank you.